Starwalker Studios presents Game Master's Journey, a podcast all about tabletop role-playing games from the perspective of the captain's chair. This episode is brought to you by Texas Beard Company. Use the coupon code GameMaster for a 15% discount at texasbeardcompany.com. I've gotten a lot of listener feedback on recent topics, including the Star Wars RPG dice system, political games, Sandbox games, and more. Tonight, I'll stand by the fire and go through some of the highlights. So join me on the journey. Together, we can become game masters truly worthy of the title. Hello, listener. Welcome to episode 44 of Game Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. I'm very excited to be coming at you with a new episode tonight. I brought the Obsidian Monolith in close to a Earth-like planet and came on down, built a nice fire so that we could have a little chat today about some of the awesome feedback that I've been getting recently about past episodes. So first of all, just for any new listeners that might be listening tonight for the first time, I want to let you know that this is what I call an Unplugged episode, and I call it that because it's a little bit different than the regular shows. It's a little bit more freeform, more stream of consciousness. It's not as heavily edited. And it's just a way that I can get some more content out to you a couple, 2-3 times a month, get you a bonus episode without having to spend so much time producing it as I do the regular episodes. Because right now, if I did the full amount of time, I probably wouldn't be able to do these nearly as often. I've heard from one or two people who seem to have heard one of these episodes for their first episode, and they're complaining about things like, I take too long to get to the point, or it's too stream of consciousness or whatever. And that's intentional. That's kind of the point of these episodes. But the regular show hopefully isn't so much like that. So if this isn't your thing, just check out one of the regular episodes. But yes, this is an Unplugged episode. This is not the usual format of the show. I have a few thank yous I want to get out there into the internet land. I don't know what to call it. Before I get into the main topics today, first of all, I want to let you know that I got the new Patreon page set up. So you can find that at patreon.com/Starwalker Studios. So this is the Patreon to rule them all. Going forward, this is going to be the one Patreon for Starwalker Studios. So if you're new to the show or you're new to my podcast and you want to support the show, you're not sure where to go to patreon.com/Starwalker Studios. That's the place to be. In the past, I had Patreons for each individual podcast that I've done. Unfortunately, the way Patreon works right now is they can't handle a content producer having more than one thing that they produce. So I have to create new accounts with different associated email addresses and different logins and passwords for every single Patreon page I want to make. So it's a huge pain for me to keep track of and to keep up on. And I feel like it's one of the reasons I don't put out as much patron stuff as I would like, is because I'm just overwhelmed with like 8 different Patreons. Plus then there's Joyride on top of that. So during the break, Nikki and I talked about it, and we decided that going forward, it would make a lot more sense just to have one for the entire studio. Now, this might be a downer for you if you only listen to one of my shows to have the other shows in there. But how is more free content a downer, right? But it'll be really great for any of you who listen to more than one of my shows, because now you can become a patron once on one Patreon page, and any bonus material I make for any show, you're going to get it because it's all going in one place. And another cool thing about this that I really like about this idea is it will allow me to try to start to pull together the different communities that have formed around my different shows into a larger Uber community, which would be really cool. Unfortunately, the feed on Patreon is extremely limited, and the formatting's pretty terrible on it. So I don't know how successful I will be with that on Patreon. But if you are a patron, feel free to use the feed. And I don't honestly know if you as a patron can make posts or not, but I know that you can comment on posts that I make. So feel free to say hi to me and your fellow patrons. So I spent hours and hours. I literally spent like 8 hours going through the entire Starwalker Studios site, and I have fixed every Patreon link I can find. I've fixed all the Patreon buttons on all the shows. So you should, if you go to your podcast of choice on starwalkerstudios.com and you click on the Patreon button at the top of the show notes of one of the episodes, it should take you to the correct new Patreon page. So it should all be worked out. For those of you that are patrons of one of the individual shows, maybe you're a patron of Game Master's Journey on that page, or you're a patron of GM Intrusions, or maybe you're supporting Game Master's Journey on Joyride, I really request and just please, when you get a chance, please move your support over to the new page, because as time goes on, I'm not going to support those other things anymore. Really, the only one that's going current right now is the one for Game Master's Journey. So any bonus content that I release for Game Master's Journey specifically, I will try to also cross post that on the Game Master's Journey Patreon and Joyride, just for the few of you that are over there. But I'm not going to do that forever. I'm just doing that for a little while, kind of as a service for you guys, so that you can have some time to get moved over. But ultimately, everything's going on the new Patreon at Starwalker Studios Patreon, and I'm not going to be updating the other ones anymore after, I don't know, a few weeks or something. So yeah, please move over. I really appreciate it. And I'm going to be working on getting bonus content up there for you guys. One of the new patron rewards is access to a new monthly show I'm going to do just for the patrons. So you can learn more about that at patreon.com/Starwalker Studios, or just go to starwalkerstudios.com and click one of the many Patreon buttons, and it'll take you right there. Speaking of patrons, I want to send some thank yous and shout outs to some new patrons. Some of these are truly new patrons who have just come on board, and then some are patrons that have been on other patron pages and have moved over to the new page. So a huge thank you to Derek, Kevin, Josh, and Chris for becoming patrons. I really appreciate it, guys. Thank you so much. And I also want to send a huge thank you and shout out to Adriano for your donation. Thank you so very much. I really appreciate it. And finally, I would like to thank Ixis for your 5-star review on iTunes. So Ixis, whose title of his review is, "I don't like most gaming podcasts, but I like this one." That's awesome that you like this one, even though you normally don't like gaming podcasts. Ixis says, "I run games mostly, so most podcasts with actual play or news isn't too important for me. But tips and ideas for running games is sorely needed. Glad this podcast exists." Thank you, Ixis. I also want to thank Wolfish Hunger, who says, "Great host voice." Thank you, Wolfish Hunger. I try. I guess it's the only voice I got, right? Lex Starwalker has a fantastic radio voice, and it permeates through the whole cast and makes it very fun and educational. Okay, now I'm pretty sure I'm blushing. I just wonder if his fireside episodes are actually outside beside a fire. So thank you so much for that review, Wolfish Hunger. And of course, I'm by a real fire. The Obsidian Monolith is parked in orbit. I'm down here by a real fire. Truly. Also, thank you, DM Nell. His review is titled "Excellent TRPG Podcast." Lex, longtime listener, you have by far the best quality TRPG podcast. Thank you, DM Nell. That means a lot. I don't agree with everything you discuss, but I enjoy listening to every episode. That's awesome. And I'm fine with people not agreeing with me. And I'd love to hear from people who don't agree with me. It's always a great discussion. One request from me would be walk us through your game prep process. This includes everything from coming up with content for a game session, how you pick NPCs, monsters, other challenges you come up with like environmental effects and or traps, how you choose magic items, how the session fits into the overall campaign story, etc. Not many, if any, podcasts go through this process in detail. Then, as a follow-up, you can talk about how the session went versus how you thought it would go, and what you prepped that was useful, not so useful, a waste of time, spot on, perfect planning, etc. Keep up the great work. Thank you, DM Nell. That is a brilliant suggestion, which reminds me, I really hate that you can't copy paste from iTunes. What the fuck? See, if this were a Windows program, I would be able to copy paste this great idea from him so I could save it and do this, because that's a great idea for an episode. I'll definitely take a stab at it. So I will definitely do that, DM Now. However, you say you're a longtime listener, so you probably know this, but if you haven't checked them out, definitely check out my Obsidian Monolith episodes, because that's sort of, I did some of what you're talking about here in that I created a campaign and kind of brought you along for the ride for that. There was one episode, I think it was called How to Prep a Numenera Session or something like that, where I talked a bit about how I specifically would prepare to run a session of that game. But I think this is a really great idea for a topic, and I'm currently running D&D and hopefully going to be running some Star Wars soon. So maybe I can do that with one or even both of those games. I also want to thank Jeremy DG for your 5-star review on iTunes. Jeremy says, I'm a new listener, but I've worked through several episodes, and so I think I've got enough to go on to post a valid review. Lex does a good job of staying on topic, which I really appreciate. Thank you, Jeremy. I actually try and edit very hard to do that. I've been through a lot of gaming podcasts over the last few years, and one of the fatal flaws of many is the tendency of the host or panel to ramble or get off topic and stay there. Lex doesn't do that. Thank you. I try very hard. His shows are of a reasonable length, and the vast share of the time is spent on topic. So you get what you signed on for. Additionally, the sound quality is consistently good and balanced between him and his guests. He obviously knows how to work the sound and does so effectively for his listeners. Thank you, Jeremy. I really appreciate that. And I have had the same observation myself, not just with gaming podcasts, but just podcasts in general. I'm the kind of person, if I turn on a podcast about Star Wars, I want to hear about Star Wars. I don't want to hear about random things that have nothing to do with Star Wars. And, different strokes for different folks. Some people actually like podcasts where people just randomly ramble about things in their lives and stuff like that. And I just don't get into that. So I very much, when I make shows, I very much try to stay focused and try to stay on topic, at least as much as possible. But it is kind of a balance, because sometimes you do want to be able to digress a little bit just to, show some personality and help you feel like you actually know me as a person and that there's more to me than just role-playing games. But, at the end of the day, this is an RPG show, and that's what you guys have signed on for. That's what you came here looking for. And so that's what I should deliver. And I shouldn't waste your time with things that have nothing to do with the show. So thank you, everyone, for the reviews. I really appreciate it. I've just been getting lots of reviews lately. They've been rolling them in, maybe because I'm reading them on the show now. But I don't know. I resisted reading iTunes reviews on the show for a long time because I thought it was narcissistic and kind of pointless and non-relevant. And maybe for some shows that would be true, but for this show, the reviews I get are so thoughtful and really do a good job of showing what people like about the show and why people listen to the show when there's so many shows out there that you could listen to. So I think it's helpful, and we get reviews with show topics for the future. So great stuff. So thank you, everyone, for the reviews. And thank you for the support, patrons, and Adriano for your donation. I really appreciate it. So speaking of, this is sort of a review, I guess. I got a message from Bread Rising on Reddit who says, I've been a fan of your podcast for a while now and am glad whenever I hear you talk about Edge of the Empire. I like talking about Edge of the Empire. I've used your world creation tips in the past to help me get started on my GM journey, so thanks for that. Keep up the great work. Thank you, Bread Rising. I love it when I hear from new GMs who say that, they're GMing for the first time and they found things I do helpful, because that's awesome. We always need more good GMs. Also, in regards to last or 2 episodes ago, episode 42, I talked about how to be a better player. And one listener, Benjamin Wenham, went ahead and wrote a blog article on the topic, kind of expanding upon what I said in the episode. So I will have that linked in the show notes for this episode 44, at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney/44. And it's a great article. Check that out. And he also, in his article, recommends another article on the topic on the Look Robot blog. And so I'll have a link to that in the show notes as well. Great stuff. Great tips on how to be a better player. I also heard from Jeremy Gipton, is how I'm going to guess that's pronounced. Sorry if I butchered your last name, Jeremy, who wrote in about the Star Wars dice system. And this is something I've been really interested in lately, as I've been playing and running Star Wars myself, and starting to kind of dip my toe into the water and just wondering, how is this dice system really going to shake out in the long term? And so Jeremy has some thoughts. He says Star Wars dice system is pretty cool, and once you memorize the symbols, easy enough to work with. Where the system loses elegance is in deciding how to adjudicate the results. It's not the canceling out of opposing symbols that's an issue. Rather, it's trying to figure out what an advantage, threat, triumph, or despair ought to generate at the table that bogs things down. I ran an Edge of the Empire campaign for a few months last year and ran a game at a local con and ran into the same issue both times. Figuring out that you had X successes or failures and Y advantages or whatever was not an issue. Coming up with, on the fly, something that fit the moment in the story to express those things was. What ended up happening a lot of times is that we just default to the tables and offer mechanical expressions instead of anything story related, because it was hard to come up with something that fit every time. And I have seen this too. For example, you shoot. You get 2 successes and a threat. Okay, what's threatening to you? You take a negative next time or give your opponent a bonus. But aside from that mechanical expression, what happens in the story? That bogged the table down and thus cut into the elegance and cool story-driving potential of the dice system. Additionally, when you compare the many rules and equipment options from the Edge of the Empire basic box and the full book, the system in the full book is deceptively crunchy. Add to that the funky dice, and things slow down a lot unless everyone at the table is really well versed in the rules and has a book to which they can refer while at play. So that's really interesting. Thank you very much, Jeremy, for that email. And Jeremy seems to be echoing what Sean was saying that I talked about in the last episode, which as he so wonderfully referred to it as the relentless granularity of the dice, which I love that phrase. So here's some words from someone else who's had some experience with the system that's kind of saying similar things. That it's not so much canceling out the symbols and everything. Once you get proficient, that goes pretty quickly. It's deciding what it all means, right? And I've definitely seen this, the little bit that I've run and played the game. Sometimes it's really cool when it's an epic, dramatic moment and you have all these dice to interpret and get to come up with something interesting that happens. That's really cool. But sometimes you just want to make a simple roll and move on with the story. And it can really be frustrating and bog things down. So I am really curious how this shakes out. I'm hoping to start my own campaign pretty soon, and I'm going to have at least 1 or 2 players at the table who've never played the game before. And I myself have only run the beginner boxes. I've run the Edge and the Force and Destiny beginner boxes, which, in those the rules are very, very pared down from what's in the core book. So I'm really curious to see, how much proficiency does it take from all the players at the table to get a good pace going. So we'll see. We'll find out. But I have noticed, what these guys are talking about, which is where, it can slow play down, especially, at times when you don't really care about the granularity. And so I've thought about, how I might handle that. And right now my ideas are, as I mentioned, I think last episode, a combination of just not asking for rolls that aren't necessary, even though I kind of like to do that sometimes just to get a feel for things. And also just not being afraid to tell my players, hey, on this roll, I really don't care. Just tell me if you succeeded or failed. I really don't care about advantage. I don't care about threat. I don't, now despair or triumph, we'll probably work that in if that comes up. But otherwise, I just want to know, did you succeed or not? And let's move on. So I think that's kind of the trick with this system. As a GM, you've got to be comfortable with doing that and have a good communication with your players so that you all know when this matters and when it doesn't, and we can just get on with the story. I also got an email from Sam Sarpedy. I'm fairly certain I did not say that right. I apologize, Sam. I've never seen that last name before. I have no idea how to pronounce that. Who says, as a new GM, your campaign, The Obsidian Monolith, was by far the best I encountered for explaining how to GM. Thank you, Sam. Especially since it is the first time I have GM'd anything. Also, I would like to thank you for your podcast, Game Master's Journey, since I learned a metric ton from you there. Many thanks and kind regards, Sam. Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate it. And I'm glad that you are enjoying the Obsidian Monolith. I've been getting a lot of feedback on that lately. I've had a lot of new listeners discover the Obsidian Monolith, and a lot of you really enjoy it and find it helpful. And I have had questions from people who wonder where the rest of it is, because I have actual plays for parts of the campaign, but not the entire campaign. And also in my write-ups, I go into quite a bit of detail on some of the adventures in the campaign, but not all of them. So to answer those questions for everybody, I do actually have audio for the actual play sessions that I never released, but it's unedited raw audio. And it was a lot of time and work to produce those episodes. If you've listened to many actual plays podcasts before, and then you've listened to my Obsidian Monolith actual play episodes, you may have noticed that mine are much more heavily edited. I edit out, pauses and off-topic conversations and try to keep a really good clip going through the whole session. And it's a ton of editing, and I had everybody on separate tracks, so I could really, get rid of people talking over each other and stuff like that. But it just took a lot of time. And at the time I was releasing those, I was getting a little bit of feedback on them. It seemed like there were a handful of people that were listening to them and really enjoying them. But for the most part, it seemed like people either weren't listening or didn't care, or at least didn't care enough to let me know. So I stopped doing them. Maybe someday in the future I might return and finish editing those and release the rest. But to be brutally honest, I would say the chances of that are pretty slim. If I ever get a burr up my ass to do an actual play again, I would rather do something new. I would rather probably do a different game. And I would probably try to do it in person. Now that I'm living in Seattle, there's a lot more gamers here, and I could potentially put together an in-person group where I could have much better audio quality than online. But it's a lot of work to produce those with, frankly, not much benefit to me to do them. And, when it doesn't seem like there's a lot of people that are really into it, it's just not worth it. But maybe someday in the future, I might do another actual play. We'll see. And then regarding the actual written adventures, yes, I have not written out every single adventure for the campaign. Originally, I was planning to publish the Obsidian Monolith, and so especially in the beginning, I was really writing things out, and that's a lot of what you see on the blog. But for reasons, I decided not to pursue publishing it, and so once that decision was made, I from that point on just wrote things out to the degree that I needed to run the game for my group. I didn't do these extensive write-ups anymore. However, what I've been telling people is I think if you listen to the actual play, you listen to the Obsidian Monolith episodes of the podcast, and you read the blog, I think even the adventures I don't go into a lot of detail in, there's enough there that you could do your own thing with it. And, any gaps that there are, just fill it in with your own stuff. I've got the skeleton of the campaign there for you. So I'm a strong believer that when running something published, you should make it your own anyway. So I guess if I don't give you the whole campaign, you have to, right? But anyway, so hopefully that answers those questions for people that have them. All right, I want to take a quick break and talk about my new sponsor, Texas Beard Company. And I'm really happy to have Texas Beard Company on board. I use their products myself. I've been growing my own beard since January, and since it seems like a lot of the people listening to this show are male, which I'd love to have more ladies listening to the show, but according to Google Analytics, over 90% of my listeners, or at least people that go to my website, are male. And considering that most tabletop gamers that I know who are male have beards, I thought this was a natural sponsor. And their products are handmade in Texas. They have all kinds of great beard care products, including soaps and oils and brushes and everything you need to keep your beard looking great and feeling great. And if you visit their website, texasbeardcompany.com, and you use the coupon code GameMaster at checkout, you will get 15% off your entire order. And you also always receive free shipping on all orders over $25 at texasbeardcompany.com. I got an email from Nathaniel Starr a while ago who would like to suggest or request a topic for a future episode. He says, I'm a huge fan of the classic World of Darkness. That setting is amazing. The mood, the themes, and the ideas are fantastic. And I agree. But I feel like I've always been playing it wrong. In one of your first podcasts, you said that you played World of Darkness and had quote-unquote political games. I'd love to know how to do that and really find out what you mean. I know that type of game is intended by the designers of the Storyteller games, but it has always evaded me. I'm more of a story type guy where the conflict is resolved in the end, usually by combat. Furthermore, I think most players think that way too, and I would agree with that. If you threaten them, then 99% of the time, even with the most role-playing centric player, it always gets physical, at least eventually. So I'd love to hear your take on it. All right, so this is a topic I would love to talk about in great detail, but I don't really feel qualified to do so. So to answer your question of kind of what I mean by a political game, when I first played Vampire, it was the first time I played an RPG that kind of revolved around social things as opposed to just physical combat. So before I played Vampire, I'd played a lot of D&D, and I'd played a lot of Star Wars, and both those games, at least the way I ran them and the way the GMs I played under ran them, it was very much like watching an action movie, right? And there was, a lot of combat and a lot of action, and the stories usually involved having to defeat some evil or whatever in combat, and that's how things were resolved. Well, in Vampire, the way it was presented and the way my GM ran it, was, you actually a lot of times wanted to avoid combat. For one thing, there was the masquerade to be concerned about, which is to say, as a vampire, you don't want to be using supernatural powers in full view of normal humans, because part of the shtick of that world is that people don't know vampires exist, and the vampires want to keep it that way. So they have the masquerade to protect themselves from humans. So that eliminates a lot of the combats you might have, because you don't want to use your supernatural abilities because of the masquerade. And if you're going to be fighting other vampires, you want to be able to use your supernatural abilities, right? And then the other part of it was just the politics within the vampires themselves, and the fact that your player was a neonate, a newly created vampire who's, weak and inexperienced and doesn't know a lot. And the cities are run by these elder vampires that are very old and powerful and have a lot of resources and knowledge and allies and all that stuff. So, most people you encountered were probably more badass than you were. So the last thing you want to do is piss people off and motivate them to fight you, because you'd probably lose, right? So because of that, the games were much more focused on social intrigue and, using social and political methods to one up your opponents as opposed to just fighting them. So that's kind of what I meant by a political game. And it just opened my mind to this whole other way to play a game, and this whole other way to handle conflicts in a game, that, bullets don't need to be flying and swords don't need to be swinging for a game to be tense and exciting. You can do it with social situations, which is really cool. Now, as to, how to run a political game, that's where I feel I'm definitely not the best person to talk about that. I try to do that. And basically what I do is I try to develop my NPCs and have NPCs that have motivations and have reasons for doing what they do, and they have long-reaching plans that they're trying to bring to fruition. And then I set up NPCs that are in opposition. So, NPC number 1 wants this thing, and NPC number 2 wants this other thing, and both these things can't happen. One of them's going to succeed, one of them's going to fail, things like that. And then I set up as many of these as I can, and then I get the players pulled into that. And I think one of the tricks to running a good political game like that, because for me, a good political game should have a lot of intrigue. In my mind, they're synonymous. Intrigue. Political games have intrigue in my mind. That's what makes them fun, I think. And so the way to establish the intrigue is for the players never to really quite know what's going on, never to know who's their friend and who's their enemy, never to really know why people are doing what they're doing, what their real agenda is. So, there's countless TV shows, that you can watch to get inspiration for stuff like that. But just having every NPC have a lot of secrets and have a secret agenda, and just creating as much conflict as you can, and then putting the PCs down in the middle of that and making them learn what's going on and learn who they can trust and who they can't, and who's out to get them and who's not, and stuff like that. So that's I can't really do a whole episode on it because I really don't have a lot, but that's kind of what I try to do in a nutshell, to try to make things more political. And then also, just having NPCs that are way too powerful for the PCs to fuck with, right? If you put an adversary on the board who could annihilate, that's not even a word, who could annihilate the entire party without breaking a sweat, and that is obvious to the players, like in a D&D game, this could be a dragon or a powerful demon. In Vampire, it could be a very old and powerful vampire. If the players understand that this NPC is way beyond them, then they have to find other ways of coping with this NPC other than combat, because if they resort to combat, they'll lose. So that's another great way to kind of bring some more politics into your game. And then also, I guess, having factions, right? So Vampire has this with you have the vampires versus the other supernaturals. You've got the vampires versus the mortals. You've got the Camarilla versus the Sabbat. Within the Camarilla, you've got the various clans that are at odds. So that's another way to bring in some politics, is to have different factions who are opposing one another. I got an email from Kevin Campbell, who has some great thoughts and advice on running sandbox games. First of all, Kevin says, I don't think anyone enjoys pure on-the-rails games, at least in tabletop. There's a certain threshold of GM control versus freedom that everyone has a slightly different preference for. It's good to get a feel for that ahead of time from your players, since there are a lot of gamers out there who really hate when games get a little too open for them, because not all gamers are good at coming up with character drives. Those are the characters that often get pushed aside, while more active and vocal players will constantly get the spotlight, which happens in sandbox games. And yeah, I can totally see that happening. So always a good idea to find out from your players kind of what they like. You know, no sense in trying to run a sandbox game if nobody likes sandbox games. When it comes to sandbox versus railroading, in LARPs, sandbox is king out of necessity. In a LARP, most of the story and drama is generated and propelled forward by the characters and their drives, usually based around politics and resources. The reason most tabletop games don't go this route is because there's a lack of support. Some of the most boring games I've ever played in were sandbox ones because the GM has a tendency to be inflexible and sit to the side while everyone else scrambles to figure out where to go next. I often do sandbox for my players currently because it's usually what they want out of a game. It's also a lot easier for me to run because I don't have to come up with the whole campaign in a traditional narrative sense. The first trick is to know the rules well enough that you can kind of guess how difficult or easy a task will be based on context. And that's good for any kind of game you're going to run, to know the rules as well as you can. The second trick is to get used to making guesses as to how a story will play out ahead of time. You can also seed story threads to the players without knowing where or how the story will pay off. For instance, I often present my players with a unique situation and direct the story based on how the players react. Let's say I'm running Numenera. The players find a baby on the side of the road surrounded by a circle of broken hound corpses or something similar. If the players approach the baby with caution, that suggests that they assume the baby might be involved with the corpses, in which case maybe the infant is secretly a monster. If the players rush to the baby's side and watch the horizon for the child's parents, then maybe the baby was lost to some superhuman parents. If the party checks the corpses first, perhaps they were involved in a ritual to summon the baby. I don't know what the story will be, but already I have a few options. All I need to do is then push the story in one direction that makes the most sense to me. At this point, the players are going to do logical things in determining what's going on in the situation, which will play out in a predictable way. If I decided that the baby was summoned, then I can give very general and predictable hints along the way as the players uncover the mystery. Other than that, I write things down. I like to give my players drives for their characters if they don't come up with their own. Things like find my lost brother or get revenge on a rival ninja clan. This way, the story can continue without needing to fall on the usual something evil is happening in the wilderness, and you need to fight your way up through bandits, cultists, necromancers to solve it. This gives you some space between your Chekhov's guns and the payoff. This can also revivify dead ends in a story. Maybe the baby's parents were out of town, but since a day has passed, they are now snooping around the area. At the end of the day, notes and going with your gut on how stories work are your greatest assets. Also character drives. Half the time, the players write the stories themselves. Obviously, this doesn't help when the players need to go into a dungeon or generally do something that requires a lot of out-of-game setup. I like to make it clear up front that a dungeon or strong encounter is getting closer, which tends to direct players to the local potion magic item shops. And there's a lot you can do there to stretch time, especially if you have players that like to haggle down prices. I can't stress enough how much getting a gut feeling for storytelling and manipulating character goals can help you run a sandbox game. If you think of the physics of the world in terms of storytelling instead of gaming, then you'll be good. But then again, that's not everyone's cup of tea. A lot of players want everything to be as square and fair as possible and don't want a simple challenge to become harder simply because it's more dramatic. Yeah, I'd probably be one of those players. As always, anticipating player expectations is paramount. And also, of course, having players who are willing to play ball. Some players get spiteful and go off the rails simply because they feel that they are on rails, and others stand at the side of the road staring at a child covered in blood, not sure what to do. So very good advice from Kevin if you are interested in doing more sandbox style games. And I agree with a lot of what he's saying here. I would add to this that, in my experience at least, games on either side of this railroad versus sandbox spectrum are not very fun. If you have a game that is just completely on a railroad and the players don't really have any choices to make as far as the plot goes, it's like you're playing a very linear video game. Those aren't fun. On the other side of the spectrum, if you are in a pure sandbox where there is no story, the GM is not presenting anything for you to react to, you're just given a map and asked what you want to do, those are not fun either. For me, at least, the real sweet spot is somewhere in between, and it's finding a good mix. You know, you want some plot in your story. You want there to be a point to everything, right? If you watched a movie and there was no point and no plot and it never went anywhere and it was just random events, you probably would not be very satisfied with that movie. And role-playing games are the same way. You want your characters to have arcs. You want the story to have an arc. You want it to make sense. You want things to flow one to another. And you want there to be a feeling of direction and purpose and momentum and all that. And you can't have that if there's no story at all. You can't have that. But on the other end, you know, you don't want the story to be so rigid that your players can't react and make decisions without screwing up your story, right? So it's kind of tricky. You got to find the balance that works for you. I know I am getting ready to start running Star Wars in the near future, and I've been preparing for that. And I am preparing for that campaign very differently than I did for the Obsidian Monolith. And I prepared for the Obsidian Monolith very differently than I have prepared other campaigns in the past, because I was at the time thinking I might publish it. But normally I don't do that kind of prep ahead of time for a campaign to the degree that I did with the Obsidian Monolith. But with my Star Wars Edge of the Empire game that I'm preparing for, I'm preparing it very differently than I did the Obsidian Monolith, in that I don't even really have a storyline in mind at this point. I have a setup. I have an idea of where the characters are starting, kind of some things that are going on around them that they're going to have to deal with. And then I have some very general ideas of things that I want to do with the story. I want to involve one or more huts and their Khajiits, and having the players caught between maybe two or more Khajiits and having to deal with that. I want to maybe bring in Black Sun and have some things going on with Black Sun behind the scenes that maybe the players do or don't figure out are going on. At some point, I might want to tie in the rebellion against the Empire, and maybe they end up working for the rebellion, or maybe they end up working against the rebellion. So I have these general ideas of story elements I want to bring in, but I haven't decided exactly how or when or even what order I'm going to bring those in, because I want to wait and let the players make their characters and come up with their backgrounds and their motivations and their obligations and all that stuff, and then take that and look at all my ideas I have and say, okay, which of these ideas really work well with what the players have given me? And those are going to be things that are going to be implemented pretty soon. Which ideas will work, but maybe need some setup, so those will be implemented later. And maybe there's some ideas that just aren't going to work, and I just need to scrap those. Or it could be a thing of, well, I can't do everything I want to do because there's just not enough time, and I have to kind of cherry pick the things that I think will be the most fun and best fit the characters. So for instance, if I have a player make a Force user who is on the path to learning about the Jedi and trying to bring back the Jedi Order, then that's going to be a very different campaign than if they're all just smugglers and bounty hunters and thieves and stuff like that. Because now suddenly morality is an issue, and not just a mechanic morality, but just morality in general. And, where maybe, a group of just outlaws would trade in slaves, maybe one with a Jedi wannabe won't. Well, probably definitely won't, right? Maybe a group of just outlaws would be fine running spice, and maybe the Jedi wannabe won't. So then we have this whole new dynamic of, are the rest of the PCs just going to not let him in on what the cargo really is? Or are they going to have to try to make a living as kind of moral, ethical smugglers who won't, they won't run slaves, they won't run guns unless it's to the rebellion. They won't run spice, things like that, which would make it very difficult to get ahead as a smuggler and make a good profit. So, the player choices in character creation are going to steer things a lot. And then, of course, the player choices during play are going to steer things a lot. So, again, this isn't a total railroad, but it's not a total sandbox either, because there is going to be a story that I will come up with as the campaign unfolds. I'm just not coming up with that before character creation and before we started playing. I'll be kind of incorporating what happens in the campaign and planning a few sessions ahead and putting a story together that way. So again, it's somewhere in the middle. It's not railroad. It's not sandbox. It's somewhere in the middle, which is where I think you want to be. Well, that's going to wrap up episode 44 of Game Master's Journey. Thank you so much for tuning in for yet another episode, another Unplugged episode. If you would like to reach me, please email me at gamemastersjourney@gmail.com. You can follow me on Google+, search for Lex Starwalker, and you can follow me on Twitter at Lex Starwalker. Please visit the website, starwalkerstudios.com. There you can find the show notes for this episode and all the episodes of Game Master's Journey with helpful links. I'll have those blog articles I mentioned linked in there. Also, you can find our Patreon button, which will take you to the new Patreon page, a donate button if you'd like to make a donation. Also, our iTunes and Stitcher buttons if you would like to go subscribe on iTunes or Stitcher or leave me a review, which I would greatly appreciate it. At the bottom of the show notes, you will find a link to the Game Master's Journey Google Plus community. I really hope you'll join us there. You'll also find links to my YouTube and Twitch channels, which reminds me, regarding my Tyranny of Dragons game that I've been running since January, I think. I was streaming that on Twitch and then putting it on YouTube, but due to my internet being less than stellar where I'm living right now, and having some issues with Twitch and with the software I was using to stream to Twitch, I am currently not streaming that to Twitch. Instead, I am streaming it using Google Hangouts on Air. So when those games run, which is every Thursday at 3:30 Pacific, 6:30 Eastern, you can go to my YouTube channel at youtube.com/c/Starwalker Studios, or just click the YouTube button in the show notes, and you can watch it live there, or of course you can watch it later there. And you can also go to the Google Hangouts on the Air event page and watch it live there, and there you can comment if you like. And I believe when you load the live video on YouTube, it's going to have a link to take you to the event page if you want to comment. But otherwise, I usually will post that in the Game Master's Journey Google Plus group, the link to that event page if you want to watch while we're playing live. Also, at the bottom of the show notes, you will find our free 30-day trial to Audible books, which you really help us out when you use that. And you'll find our Amazon referral link I hope that you have a chance to play your favorite RPG this week. I will be back next week with another episode of Game Master's Journey. Until then, game on.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music provided by Cloudwalker, Renfield, Transboy, and Ish. Please see the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/GameMastersJourney.